The alarm on my wrist console screamed before I even understood why. My name is Vexthar Knoll, and I was standing behind the trade counter on Orbital Platform 6 when a human woman placed a handful of small metal discs on the glass and asked me if I took card instead. I did not know what card meant. I did not know what the discs meant either, but my translator implant did, and what it told me made my 4 hearts freeze at once. She had just tried to buy a war-class star cruiser with what my implant labeled, in bright red warning script, as an act of ritual insult. Let me back up for one moment, because you need to understand how fast everything unraveled after that. I had been posted to Earth's trade platform for 11 months. It was not a reward posting. Nobody in the Chrysalin Compact wanted to be assigned to humanity's doorstep, because humans were, in the polite language of my superiors, unpredictable. In the less polite language used in the officers' mess, they were called reckless children holding matches near a fuel depot. I had heard every joke. I had heard every warning. None of it prepared me for the woman standing in front of me that afternoon. My training on human behavior had consisted mostly of recorded lectures, second-hand reports from other trade platforms, and a single mandatory course that spent more time discussing human sporting events than actual negotiation habits. It had not covered this. Nothing in my training had ever covered a scenario where a visitor casually treated the purchase of a warship the same way she might treat a stall selling fruit at a weekend market. Her name, according to the transaction log, was Marin Doyle. She was tall, with short brown hair, and a jacket that looked like it had seen 100 different weather patterns. She had walked into the trade kiosk the way humans walk into everything, like she owned the building and was only mildly interested in staying. She had asked to see our catalog of decommissioned vessels. This was not unusual. Many species, once they reached a certain level of technological trust with the Compact, were permitted to browse retired war-class cruisers, the kind used as coming-of-age defense ships for younger member worlds. It was a formality. Humanity had only recently crossed that threshold, and most humans who came to look never actually tried to buy one, because the price displayed on the ledger was, by any reasonable standard, enormous. Marin Doyle looked at the price. The number glowed above the counter in shifting blue characters, translated automatically into her currency. Several million standard credits. I watched her eyes move across it. I expected her to laugh, thank me, and leave, the way most visitors did. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small handful of coins. "That's a bit steep," she said, dropping them onto the counter with a soft metallic clatter. "I've got some spare change if that helps. You take card instead." I stared at the coins, small, round, worth almost nothing, even by human economic standards. My translator implant, which had been trained on centuries of interspecies protocol, flagged the phrase spare change under a category I had never personally seen triggered before. It was filed under coded diplomatic insult, subtype, valuation contempt, the kind of statement one civilization made to another when it wanted to say, without saying it directly, that the other side's greatest weapon was worth less than pocket lint. I had studied this category during training. I had never expected to hear it spoken by a smiling woman in a weathered jacket, standing in front of a coffee cart 2 platforms down from the diplomatic wing. "I am sorry," I said, keeping my voice level, even as my internal system spiked with warning tones only I could hear. "Could you repeat that offer?" "Spare change," she said again, tapping the coins with one finger. "You know, loose money. I don't carry much cash on me. Figured I'd see what you had lying around instead. Worth a shot, right?" I glanced past her shoulder toward the transaction terminal, half expecting some kind of automated safeguard to intervene, some system warning that would explain this away as a glitch rather than a genuine offer. Nothing happened. The terminal simply sat there, patiently waiting, the price still glowing in the air between us, as ordinary and unbothered as it had been a moment earlier. It struck me, even then, how strange it was that a moment capable of shaking an entire diplomatic relationship could look so utterly unremarkable from the outside. No sirens, no dramatic pause. Just a woman with a paper cup, waiting for an answer to a question she clearly considered perfectly reasonable. Worth a shot. Another phrase. My implant did not flag that one as an insult, but it did flag it as informal and dismissive, language typically used for low-stakes situations, not the acquisition of a warship capable of leveling a continent. I did not know, in that moment, whether I was looking at a diplomatic incident or a woman who genuinely believed she could haggle down the price of a war-class cruiser the way she might haggle over a piece of fruit at a market stall. Both possibilities terrified me equally, though for very different reasons. This vessel, I said carefully, gesturing at the display, is not available for informal exchange. Its value is fixed by compact treaty. Sure, Marin said, waving a hand. I figured. Just thought I'd ask. You'd be surprised what people say yes to if you just ask nicely. She scooped the coins back into her pocket, gave me a small shrug, and turned to leave, already checking something on the small device strapped to her wrist. Anyway, thanks for the look. Nice ship. Big ship. She lingered for just a moment at the edge of the kiosk, glancing back over her shoulder at the glowing image of the cruiser one last time, the way someone might glance back at a car in a dealership lot they knew they would never actually buy. There was no malice in that glance, no calculation, nothing that resembled the cold, deliberate posturing my training had taught me to recognize in genuine acts of provocation. It was simple curiosity, the kind of look a person gives something impressive on their way out the door, nothing more. And then she walked away, sipping from a paper cup she had been carrying the entire time, completely unaware that she had just, according to every rule of interspecies protocol I had ever studied, insulted an entire civilization's military honor in under 30 seconds. I stood there for a long moment after she left. The coins were gone from the counter, but their image remained frozen on my internal recording, along with the flag translation, the warning category, and a timestamp that I knew, with a sinking feeling in every one of my stomachs, I would not be able to quietly delete. Protocol was clear. Any statement flagged under valuation contempt involving a war-class vessel had to be reported within one operational cycle. There was no discretion built into the system, no option to mark it as a misunderstanding and move on. The moment my implant logged the phrase, a shadow copy of that log was already transmitted upward, through the platform's communication relay, toward Compact Fleet Command. I had not even finished my shift before my personal console lit up with a priority summons. I remember walking through the corridor toward the command relay station, past the wide viewport that looked down on Earth's blue curve, thinking that surely, someone above me would look at this the same way I did. Surely someone would see a woman with a coffee cup and a handful of coins and understand that she meant nothing by it. I was wrong, or at least I was wrong about how quickly they would understand it. By the time I reached the communication hub, 3 separate priority channels were already active, each one filled with clipped, urgent voices discussing something they called a formal valuation insult against the Compact's military honor, delivered directly to a licensed trade officer, on record, unprompted. I tried to speak. I tried to explain that the woman had not meant it as an insult, that she had likely never even heard of the diplomatic weight behind those words, that this was simply how humans spoke when they were mildly interested in a lower price. But my voice was small in that room, and the voices around me were not small at all. Someone mentioned battle readiness. Someone else mentioned the nearest fleet cluster, currently stationed 2 systems away, well within striking range of Sol if given the order. I felt my hearts drop, one after another, as I realized that a conversation about coins and coffee had, within the space of a single afternoon, become something that military officers were treating as a possible prelude to conflict. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell them how absurd this was. But nobody in that room was laughing, and I had learned, in 11 months on this platform, that when Compact officers stopped laughing, it usually meant something serious was already in motion. I looked back at the viewport one last time before I was pulled into the briefing room. Earth hung there, blue and quiet, and completely unaware, its cities lit in soft patterns across the dark side of the planet, its people going about their evenings without the faintest idea that somewhere above them, in a room full of officers speaking in urgent tones, a decision was being made about whether their planet had just declared, through the mouth of one ordinary woman, that it no longer respected the might of an entire starfaring civilization. I did not know it yet, but that was only the beginning. Whatever happened next, I understood one thing with absolute certainty as the briefing room doors sealed shut behind me. Marin Doyle had no idea what she had started, and I was going to have to be the one to explain it to people who were far more interested in preparing for war than in listening to reason. Before the doors sealed, a junior officer named Corin Vass caught my arm in the corridor, his voice low and urgent. We had trained together years earlier, back when neither of us had ever expected an assignment anywhere near Earth. "Is it true?" he asked. "Is it true a human tried to buy a cruiser with pocket coins?" I told him it was true, and watched his expression shift from disbelief to something closer to alarm. "My cousin serves on one of the outer battle groups," he said quietly. "If this turns into something real, he will be among the first ships called forward." I had no comfort to offer him. I only nodded and let him go, and carried the weight of his worried face with me into the briefing room. One more reminder that this was no longer an abstract diplomatic puzzle. Real crews, real families, real lives on both sides of the divide were now tied to the outcome of a conversation about a handful of coins. The doors closed. The lights in the room shifted to a deep tactical red. And somewhere far below us, Marin Doyle was probably still walking to her next appointment, coffee in hand, without a single thought in her head about spare change, war cruisers, or the fleet of warships that had just begun quietly repositioning themselves in the dark, cold space near her home world. The briefing room was colder than the rest of the platform, or maybe it only felt that way because of the silence. 6 officers sat around the long table, and every one of them looked at me the way you look at someone who has just tracked something unpleasant across a clean floor. At the head of the table sat Fleet Liaison Kessick Rowe, a broad-shouldered Chrysallan officer with pale gray skin and a voice that never seemed to rise above a flat, dangerous calm. He did not stand when I entered. He simply gestured at the empty seat across from him and waited until I sat down before he spoke. "Walk us through it," he said. "Exactly what she said, exactly what she did. Do not soften it, and do not summarize." I did as he asked. I described the coins on the counter, the words she used, the tone of her voice, even the coffee cup she carried. I tried to make it sound as small as it actually was. I tried to make it sound like nothing. It did not work. "Spare change," Kessick repeated slowly, tasting the words like they were something bitter. "Offered for a war-class cruiser, in front of a licensed trade officer, on official compact ground." She did not know what the phrase meant to us, I said quickly. I do not believe she intended any disrespect. Humans use casual language when discussing prices constantly, even for items of great value. It is a communication habit, not a declaration. "A communication habit," said another officer, a woman named Sela Yoon, who handled diplomatic translation review, "that happens to match, almost word for word, the ancient challenge phrasing used by the Threndel cluster before their war fleets attacked 3 compact outposts 2 centuries ago. You are aware of that history." I was aware of it. Every trade officer studied it during training. The Threndel had once used a similar phrase, "spare tribute for a war vessel," as a way of announcing that they considered compact military strength to be worthless, right before launching a devastating surprise attack. It was one of the most studied diplomatic failures in compact history, taught specifically so officers like me would recognize the warning signs early and prevent history from repeating itself. I understood, in that moment, exactly why the alarm had gone off so violently in my own systems. I also understood, with a growing sense of dread, that no matter how many times I explained the truth, the weight of that historical parallel was going to be very difficult to argue against. "With respect," I said, choosing my words as carefully as I could, "the Threndel knew exactly what they were saying. They studied our language for years before using that phrase deliberately. This woman did not know our language at all beyond her translator implant. She does not know our history. She was not making a declaration. She was haggling. It is something humans do constantly, over food, over clothing, over almost anything with a price attached to it. Then humanity haggles over warships, Keswick said, and something in his voice made my stomach twist. A species so unconcerned with the weight of military strength that they treat the purchase of a war-class cruiser the same way they treat a piece of fruit at a market stall. Tell me, Trade Officer Knoll, does that reassure you or does it concern you? I did not have an answer for him. Because the truth was, it concerned me too, though not for the reasons it concerned him. Sela Yun spoke again before I could gather my thoughts, tapping a small control on the table that pulled up an image of the Threndol conflict, grainy footage recovered from archives more than 2 centuries old. It showed a compact outpost in the final moments before an attack, its defenders unaware of what was coming, its trade officers just as confident as I had been the day before that a simple conversation had ended without consequence. "We show this recording to every new trade officer," she said, "not because we believe every misunderstanding leads to war, but because we cannot afford to assume any of them are harmless until proven otherwise. You understand the position that places you in, Trade Officer Knoll. You are the officer who decided this one was harmless before the review was complete." I felt the accusation land, even though she had not raised her voice to deliver it. It was true. I had made a judgment, quickly and instinctively, based on a handful of minutes standing across a counter from an ordinary woman with tired eyes and a paper cup. I had trusted my own read of her more than I had trusted the protocols I had spent years training to follow, and now that trust was being weighed against the safety of 2 entire worlds. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours. I answered every question they asked, over and over, rephrasing the same explanation in different ways, trying to find some combination of words that would make them understand that this was a misunderstanding and nothing more. But every time I finished speaking, Keswick would simply nod, make a note, and ask another question, as if my answers were only confirming his suspicions rather than easing them. At one point during the questioning, a younger officer near the end of the table, someone I recognized only vaguely from the platform's logistics division, asked whether it was possible the woman had simply misunderstood our currency conversion display, believing the price shown was somehow inflated by a translation error. It was a reasonable question, and for a brief moment I felt a flicker of hope that the room might finally consider a simpler explanation. Keswick dismissed it almost immediately, noting that the conversion systems had been independently verified twice already that morning, and that the price displayed to Marin Doyle had been entirely accurate, down to the smallest fractional unit. The hope I had felt a moment earlier faded just as quickly as it had appeared. By the end of the meeting, a decision had already been made above my authority. 3 compact battle groups, stationed near the outer trade lanes, were placed on elevated alert status and given new coordinates that brought them measurably closer to the Sol system. Nobody called it an attack posture. Officially, it was labeled a precautionary repositioning pending diplomatic clarification, but I had studied enough fleet doctrine to know what elevated alert and repositioning actually meant when placed together. It meant that somewhere in the chain of command above Keswick Row, someone had decided that Earth might need to be reminded, very clearly, of exactly how large the gap in power between our civilizations truly was. I left the briefing room feeling like the weight of an entire planet had somehow settled onto my shoulders in the span of a single afternoon. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my quarters, replaying the recording of Marin Doyle over and over, studying every word, every gesture, searching for something I might have missed, some clue that would explain her intentions in a way that would satisfy Compact Command. But the recording never changed. She was exactly what she appeared to be, an ordinary woman, mildly amused by the price of a spaceship, trying her luck the way she probably tried her luck at every counter she had ever stood in front of in her entire life. The next morning, I learned that human authorities had noticed the fleet movement. This should not have surprised me. Earth's detection network had improved dramatically since first contact, and 3 compact battle groups repositioning themselves anywhere near Sol space was not something that would go unnoticed for long. What surprised me was how quickly humanity responded, and how differently they responded compared to what Compact Command had expected. There was no panic, there was no distress signal, no emergency broadcast, no immediate mobilization of Earth's own defense forces, though I later learned those forces had indeed been quietly placed on alert as well. Instead, within hours, a formal but calm inquiry was transmitted to the trade platform, addressed directly to the Compact Liaison Office, asking, in polite and measured language, whether there was a reason for the recent change in fleet positioning near Earth's system, and whether there was anything humanity needed to be aware of. The message was signed by a woman named Grace Whitfield, identified as a senior coordinator for Earth's Unified Defense Council. I remember reading her message twice, struck by how calm it sounded, compared to the tension radiating through every hallway of our own command structure. She did not sound afraid. She did not sound angry. She sounded, more than anything, like someone politely asking a neighbor why there were suddenly unfamiliar vehicles parked outside her house. I was given the task of drafting a response, mostly because I was the only officer on the platform who had any direct contact with the human population, and because, I suspected, nobody else wanted to be the one to explain the situation if it went badly. I spent an entire hour trying to write something that was both diplomatically appropriate and completely honest, before finally settling on language that described the fleet movement as a routine adjustment tied to an ongoing review of trade protocols, which was, in the most technical sense, true, even if it left out the part where the review in question had been triggered by a handful of loose coins and a paper coffee cup. Grace Whitfield's reply came back within the hour. It was short. It thanked me for the clarification, noted that Earth's own monitoring systems would continue routine observation of the fleet's position as a standard precaution, and ended with a line that I found myself reading several times over, unsure exactly how to interpret its tone. She wrote that if there was ever a genuine concern involving anyone connected to Earth, humanity would appreciate being told directly, rather than through a slow buildup of warships near their front door. I showed the message to no one, not even Keswick Rowe, though I suspected it would have made little difference either way. Instead, I read it several more times that evening, sitting alone with my meal untouched in front of me, turning her words over in my mind. There was something almost painfully reasonable about them, a simple request for honesty, delivered by someone who had every reason to demand far more than that, and yet had chosen restraint instead. It struck me as a small, quiet mirror of the very trait we were currently so afraid of, a species willing to ask directly for what it wanted, rather than retreating into fear or posturing. I found myself wondering, uneasily, whether that same steady directness might be the thing that saved us from this crisis, or the thing that made it far more dangerous than any of us yet understood. I did not know, at the time, how close that sentence came to describing exactly what was happening. I only knew that somewhere below me, on a planet full of people who had no idea how fragile the peace above them had suddenly become, Marin Doyle was almost certainly still going about her ordinary life, completely unaware that her offhand comment about spare change had triggered a chain reaction now being tracked by defense councils, fleet commanders, and diplomatic officers across 2 entire civilizations. I made a decision that night, one that I knew could cost me my position if it went wrong. I decided that instead of simply reporting facts up the chain and waiting for orders, I was going to find Marin Doyle myself, and I was going to get to the truth of what she meant, directly from her, before anyone with the authority to launch a fleet decided they had heard enough second-hand explanations and wanted to see results instead. It was, in hindsight, either the smartest decision I made during the entire crisis, or the most reckless one. At the time, standing alone in my quarters, with Earth turning slowly beneath me, I honestly could not tell which. I spent a long while simply watching the planet turn, tracing the faint outlines of coastlines I had memorized without ever meaning to, city lights blinking on and off in patterns that had nothing to do with the storm quietly gathering above them. I thought about Corin Vass and his cousin, somewhere out among the repositioned battle groups, and I thought about Grace Whitfield, sitting in some office on the surface, reading my carefully worded message and almost certainly seeing straight through it. I thought, too, about how strange it was that a species capable of building trade platforms, translator implants, and starfaring cruisers could still, after everything, find itself undone by something as small as a misplaced word. It was not the first time in compact history that had happened. I doubted it would be the last, but knowing that did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest as I finally lay down, still fully dressed, and waited for a sleep that refused to come. Finding Marin Doyle turned out to be easier than I expected, and far harder than I hoped. Easier, because human trade platforms kept detailed visitor logs, and within an hour I had her registered contact information, along with a note that she worked as an independent logistics consultant, someone who helped small companies figure out how to move goods efficiently from one place to another. Harder, because the moment I requested formal clearance to leave the platform and travel down to Earth's surface for what I described only as a follow-up trade inquiry, I was informed that all non-essential travel between the platform and the surface had been quietly suspended, pending the resolution of the current diplomatic review. In other words, I was stuck exactly where I was, while the person who could actually explain everything was somewhere down on the surface, completely out of reach. I spent half a day trying to find a way around the restriction before I finally admitted to myself that there was no clever workaround waiting to be discovered. Instead, I did the only thing left to me. I requested a direct communication link with Marin Doyle, using the contact information from her visitor registration, and I hoped she would actually answer a call from an unfamiliar number belonging to an alien trade officer. She answered on the third attempt. "Hello?" Her voice came through slightly distorted, the way most human communication signals sounded when routed through compact relay systems. There was noise behind her, the low hum of a public space, maybe a transit station or a busy street. "Ms. Doyle," I said, trying to keep my voice as calm and neutral as I could manage. "My name is Vexthar Knoll. We met yesterday at the trade platform. I was the officer at the counter when you inquired about the war-class cruiser." There was a pause, and then a small laugh. "Oh, right, the big ship guy. Did you figure out if you take card?" "Not exactly," I said. "I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about our conversation. It would only take a short amount of time." "Sure, I guess," she said, sounding more curious than concerned. "Is this like a customer survey thing? Did I win something?" "No," I said, and found myself momentarily at a loss for how to continue, unused to explaining compact protocol in terms a human without any diplomatic training might actually understand. "It concerns the conversation we had at my counter." "Regarding the cruiser?" "Oh, the spaceship thing," she said, and I heard the small smile return to her voice. "Yeah, sure, ask away. Though fair warning, I don't think I have any more coins on me. I think I spent the rest on parking." "It is more of an official inquiry," I said carefully. "Would it be possible to speak somewhere more private?" Something in my tone must have shifted her attention, because the background noise faded slightly, as if she had stepped away from whatever crowd she had been standing in. "Okay, you're kind of freaking me out a little. Is everything all right? Did I do something wrong?" I chose my next words very carefully, because I knew that whatever I said next would either calm this entire situation down or make it significantly worse. "I need to understand exactly what you meant yesterday when you offered spare change for the cruiser," I said. "It is very important that I understand your intention correctly." "My intention?" She sounded genuinely confused now. "I mean, I didn't really have some grand intention. I saw the price, thought it was way more than I expected, and figured I'd try to talk it down a little. That's just kind of how I approach things. You never know until you ask, right? Worst case, someone says no." "So you were attempting to negotiate a lower price," I said slowly, recording every word. "Well, yeah," she said, and I could hear the small shrug in her voice, even without seeing her. I do it all the time. Bought my car that way. Got my rent knocked down a little when I moved into my current place. Even talked a guy down on a second-hand couch once, though that one took forever, because he really loved that couch for some reason. It's just how negotiating works, isn't it? You start low, see what happens. I sat with that for a moment, letting the full weight of her explanation settle over me. There was no hidden meaning. There was no coded challenge, no deliberate insult, no historical reference to ancient conflicts between starfaring civilizations. There was only a woman who approached every transaction in her life, no matter how large or small, with the exact same casual confidence, the same willingness to ask for a better deal, regardless of whether she was buying a couch or a warship capable of leveling cities. Did I actually offend someone? She asked, and for the first time, there was real concern in her voice, because if I did, I genuinely didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to be rude. I just thought it was worth a shot. You did not intend any offense, I said, but I need you to understand something. In our culture, the words you used carry a very different meaning than they do in yours. What you meant as a simple attempt to lower a price was interpreted by certain individuals within my command structure as a deliberate insult against the value of our military strength. There was a long pause. Wait, seriously? Because I offered you some loose change? It is more complicated than that, I said, but yes, essentially. Okay, that's actually kind of terrifying, she said, and I heard her exhale slowly. So what happens now? Am I in trouble? Is this like an international incident or something? It may already be an interstellar incident, I admitted. Fleet vessels have been repositioned closer to your solar system as a precaution. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if the connection had failed. You're telling me, she finally said, her voice quiet and careful, that I might have accidentally started some kind of space war because I tried to haggle over a spaceship. I am telling you that it is a possibility we are currently working very hard to prevent, I said, which is why I needed to speak with you directly. I needed to understand your true intentions so that I could accurately represent them to my command structure. Okay, she said slowly, and I could hear her pacing now, footsteps echoing against some hard surface. Okay, what do you need from me? I'll do whatever I can to fix this. I really didn't mean for any of this to happen. I told her that for now, the most useful thing she could do was remain available and cooperative if further contact was requested, and that I would do everything within my ability to make certain her true intentions were properly understood by those making decisions above me. She agreed immediately, without hesitation, and something about the sincerity in her voice reassured me, even as the situation around us continued to grow more complicated by the hour. Before ending the call, she asked one more question, one that stayed with me long after we disconnected. Is this normal? She asked. Like, does this kind of thing happen a lot, where someone says something totally innocent and it almost starts a war because nobody bothered to just ask what they meant first? I did not have a comfortable answer for her. Because the truth was, in the history of the Compact, this exact pattern had played out more times than I liked to admit. Civilizations meeting for the first time, each side interpreting the other through the lens of their own history, their own fears, their own assumptions about what certain words and gestures were supposed to mean. Sometimes those assumptions were correct. Sometimes, like now, they were catastrophically wrong, and the only thing standing between a peaceful outcome and a devastating one was whether someone, somewhere, took the time to actually ask a simple question before reaching for a weapon. I asked her, carefully, how a species could grow so comfortable discussing weapons of that magnitude without any visible fear coloring the conversation. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. I don't think we're actually comfortable with it, she said. I think we just learned to carry it instead of letting it stop us completely. We've got places back home built specifically to remind people what our own worst weapons did the very first time they were used. Nobody walks out of those places feeling good. But the next morning still comes, and people still have to go to work, and pay bills, and figure out dinner. I guess somewhere along the way, We decided that standing still forever, frozen by fear of something we couldn't undo, wasn't really an option, so we just kept moving instead, carefully, most of the time. Before ending the call, I asked her one final question, mostly out of my own curiosity, rather than any requirement of the investigation. I asked her whether she had ever, in her entire life, negotiated for something and simply walked away afterward, satisfied with the answer no matter which way it went. She laughed softly at that. Honestly, most of the time, she said. It's not really about winning. It's more like checking if there's room to move. If there isn't, that's fine too. I just like knowing I asked. There was something almost disarmingly simple about the way she said it, as if the entire concept of fear, of consequence, of the weight I had been trained since childhood to attach to any exchange involving military power, had simply never occurred to her as something worth carrying into a conversation about price. I recorded the entire conversation, every word, every pause, every note of confusion and concern in her voice, and I submitted it as formal evidence to Keswick Rowe's office, hoping that hearing her actual intentions, in her own words, would finally put the matter to rest. It did not. Instead, when I was summoned back to the briefing room the following morning, I found the atmosphere had shifted into something even more tense than before. Sela Yun, the diplomatic translation officer, stood at the head of the table this time, a data display hovering in front of her showing a transcript of my conversation with Marin Doyle, certain sections highlighted in sharp red. "You believe this recording clears the matter," she said, not quite as a question. "I believe it proves there was no intended insult," I said. "She approaches every transaction in her life with the same casual negotiation style. It is a cultural habit, not a coded challenge." "That is precisely the problem," Sela said, and gestured toward the highlighted section of the transcript, the part where Marin had explained that she negotiated over cars, rent, furniture, and now, apparently, war-class cruisers, all with exactly the same tone, the same confidence, the same complete absence of fear. "Trade Officer Knoll," Keswick Rowe said from the far end of the table, his voice as flat and calm as ever, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he had raised his voice entirely. "You were sent to determine whether an insult had been intended. Instead, you have returned with evidence that this species does not distinguish between the purchase of household furniture and the purchase of a weapon capable of ending a war. Do you understand why that troubles us more, not less?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught somewhere in my throat, because for the first time since this entire situation had begun, I understood exactly what he meant, and I understood that I had walked into that briefing room carrying evidence that I believed would end the crisis, when in reality, I was carrying evidence that was about to make it very much worse. Every species the Compact had ever encountered treated the acquisition of military power with at least some measure of solemnity, some acknowledgement of its weight and consequence. Even civilizations that eventually became enemies of the Compact had, at minimum, understood that warships were not something to be casually haggled over, the way one might haggle over a second-hand couch. Humanity, according to the evidence sitting on that display screen, did not draw that same line. To them, a warship and a piece of furniture existed on the same negotiable scale, subject to the exact same confident, casual approach. To me, having spent the last day speaking directly with Marin Doyle, that fact felt harmless, even a little endearing, a quirk of a species still learning its place in a much larger galaxy. But to a room full of officers who had spent their entire careers studying military doctrine, who had been trained to read subtle signals of aggression and intent in every gesture a new species made, that same fact read very differently. It read as evidence of a species entirely unafraid of the weapons it might one day wield, a species that saw immense destructive power not as something to be respected and feared, but as simply another item on a very long shopping list. Sela Yun pulled up a second display before I could leave, this one showing a wider survey of human commercial behavior gathered from the platform's public records, spreadsheets full of transaction logs stretching back months, long before Marin Doyle had ever walked up to my counter. She pointed to pattern after pattern: humans requesting discounts on shuttle fares, humans asking whether bulk trade licenses came with a lower rate, humans politely but persistently asking vendors if a price was truly final. "This is not an anomaly," she said. "This is simply how this species interacts with value across every context we have observed. They apply the same posture to a cargo permit that they apply to a war-class cruiser, because to them, apparently, there is no meaningful difference in category. Everything is negotiable, everything is worth asking about." I asked her, carefully, whether that pattern had ever been observed in any other species the compact had encountered before. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Not to this degree," she admitted. "Most species draw a clear line between commerce and consequence. Humanity, so far, does not appear to draw that line at all." It was the first time I had heard her voice waver even slightly from its usual composed precision, and it told me, more clearly than anything else that day, just how unprecedented this situation truly was. I left that briefing room understanding, for the first time since this crisis had begun, that I had not brought them reassurance at all. I had brought them something far more unsettling, and somewhere above Earth's quiet, unaware surface, I could already feel the weight of that realization beginning to tighten around all of us, like a slowly closing fist. Within a single day, everything I had done to try to calm the situation seemed to have accomplished the exact opposite. The 3 battle groups that had been placed on elevated alert 2 days earlier were now given new orders. I learned about it not through any official announcement, but through the sudden change in tone across every communication channel on the platform. Officers who had walked past me with polite nods now avoided eye contact entirely. Support staff, who once asked me casual questions about my day, now kept their heads down, moving quickly between tasks, as if proximity to me might somehow drag them into whatever was unfolding above our heads. I requested a meeting with Keswick Rowe directly, and to my surprise he granted it almost immediately, though the location had changed from the standard briefing room to a smaller, more secure chamber near the command deck, the kind typically reserved for conversations that were not meant to be recorded in the general platform log. "You wanted to speak with me," he said, without any greeting as I entered. "I need to understand the current status of the fleet," I said. "The evidence I gathered was meant to resolve this situation, not escalate it." Keswick studied me for a long moment before gesturing toward a chair. I sat, though I noticed he remained standing, arms folded behind his back, looking out through the narrow viewport at the stars beyond. "Let me explain something to you, Trade Officer Knoll," he said, "that you may not have learned during your training. Fear is manageable. A species that fears our strength can be reasoned with, negotiated with, brought into alignment through demonstration and diplomacy. We have done this many times before. But a species that does not fear our strength at all, a species that treats the greatest weapons in known space as casually as household goods, that is a different problem entirely. We cannot negotiate with an absence of fear. We cannot demonstrate consequence to a species that does not appear to register consequence in the first place." "She is one individual," I said. "You are drawing conclusions about an entire species based on one woman's negotiating habits. Have you reviewed the rest of the intelligence gathered from your platform's public communication feeds over the last 2 days?" he asked, and something in the way he said it made my stomach tighten with dread before he even continued. "Because Marin Doyle is not an isolated case. Trade Officer Knoll, our monitoring teams have identified dozens of similar incidents across human commercial exchanges on this platform alone. Humans attempting to negotiate lower prices on everything from trade licenses to shuttle transport fees to, in one particularly notable case, docking rights for a diplomatic vessel. This is not one woman's personality. This appears to be a defining trait of the entire species." I sat in silence, absorbing that, because I had not considered it from that angle. I had been so focused on proving that Marin Doyle meant no harm that I had failed to consider what her behavior actually represented on a larger scale, a pattern that Compact Command had apparently been quietly documenting the entire time I had been chasing down a single conversation. "So what happens now?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer would not be one I wanted to hear. "Fleet Command has authorized a demonstration," Keswick said. "Not an attack. A demonstration. A single battle group will move into a closer orbital position around the Sol system, sufficient to be visible to human detection networks, as a means of reinforcing the seriousness of our military capability. The intention is to remind humanity, through clear and undeniable presence, that the vessels they negotiate over so casually represent genuine and significant power, power that deserves respect rather than haggling." "You cannot know that," I said quietly. "You are assuming a single behavior, observed in a handful of transactions, reflects something fundamental about their entire civilization. What if it reflects nothing more than convenience, or habit, or something as simple as economic necessity in certain parts of their world? You are building a military response on top of an assumption." Keswick turned from the viewport to look at me directly for the first time since I had entered the room. "And you built your original assessment on top of a 30-second conversation at a trade counter," he said. "We are all working from incomplete information, Trade Officer Knoll. The difference is that my position requires me to plan for the possibility that the incomplete information points toward danger, while your position, understandably, inclines you to hope it does not. Both instincts are reasonable. Only one of them is my responsibility to act on." "That is an act of intimidation," I said, before I could stop myself. "That is a matter of perspective," Keswick replied, his flat tone never wavering. "From where I stand, it is a necessary correction, delivered before misunderstanding has the chance to become something far worse. History has taught us, many times over, that ambiguity between civilizations rarely resolves itself peacefully if left unaddressed. Better a controlled demonstration now than an uncontrolled escalation later." I wanted to argue further, but I understood, standing there in that small secure chamber, that the decision had already been made well above either of our positions, and nothing I said in that room was going to change it. What I could still influence, perhaps, was what happened after that demonstration, whether it ended there, as a simple show of strength that humanity absorbed and understood, or whether it triggered something far more dangerous in response. I left the meeting with a single thought circling through my mind, over and over, refusing to settle. If a fleet of unfamiliar warships suddenly became visible in Earth's sky, without clear explanation, without careful framing, humanity's own defense forces would very likely interpret it exactly the way Compact Command feared humanity's casual attitude might one day provoke, as the opening move of an attack rather than a demonstration meant to prevent one. I contacted Grace Whitfield immediately, using every level of clearance still available to me, and told her, as plainly as protocol allowed, that a compact battle group would soon become visible near Earth's orbital range, and that it was intended as a demonstration of strength rather than a hostile action, though I understood how difficult that distinction might be to trust from the outside. Her response came quickly, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I heard something in her tone that sounded less like calm diplomatic composure and more like carefully controlled alarm. "I appreciate you telling me directly," she said. "But I need you to understand something, Officer Knoll. If unidentified or unexplained warships become visible near our planet, Earth's own defense protocols will treat that as an immediate threat, regardless of any intention behind it. We do not have the luxury of assuming good faith from a fleet appearing without clear diplomatic framing. Our people will prepare to defend themselves. That is simply how our systems are built to respond." "I understand," I said. "I will do everything within my ability to ensure this is properly communicated and understood on both sides before that demonstration takes place." "Then you need to move quickly," she said, "because from what our own monitoring has already picked up, that fleet is closer than you may realize, and our Defense Council is already convening an emergency session to determine how to respond." Before disconnecting, Grace asked me one more question, her voice quieter now, less official. "Off the record," she said. "Do you actually believe this is going to end peacefully?" I considered lying, offering her the same careful reassurance I had been trained to give in situations like this. Instead, I told her the truth. "I do not know," I said. "I believe it can end peacefully. I do not yet know whether it will." She was quiet for a moment, and then she thanked me for my honesty, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened that day, because I had expected honesty to be the thing that finally broke whatever fragile trust remained between us, not the thing that strengthened it. I ended the call and stood alone in my quarters, staring at the star field beyond my narrow viewport, understanding with sudden and complete clarity that this crisis was no longer confined to misunderstandings between officers in a briefing room. It had grown into something far larger, something now moving on both sides of an invisible line, driven by fear, history, and the simple human habit of trying to get a better deal, no matter how large the purchase. Somewhere below me, a defense counsel I had never met was preparing contingency plans for a threat they did not fully understand. Somewhere above me, a fleet of warships was preparing to demonstrate strength to a species they did not fully understand either. And somewhere in the middle of all of it stood Marin Doyle, almost certainly still unaware that the ordinary rhythm of her daily life, the small, harmless habit of asking for a better price, had somehow become the single thread holding two entire civilizations back from a conflict neither of them actually wanted. I realized, standing there, that reports and recordings and careful explanations delivered through official channels were no longer going to be enough. If this crisis was going to end without violence, it was not going to end through paperwork, briefing rooms, or carefully worded transcripts. It was going to require something far more direct and far more risky than anything I had attempted so far. It was going to require putting Marin Doyle herself, in her own voice, directly in front of the people who had the power to decide whether Earth lived through the next few days in peace, or under the shadow of a war that had started over a handful of loose coins and a paper cup of coffee. I spent the remainder of that night drafting and discarding a dozen different plans, each one more likely to end my career than the last. I considered requesting emergency clearance through proper channels, before realizing it would take longer than the fleet's current timeline allowed. I considered appealing directly to Sailor Yoon, whose caution I respected even when I disagreed with it, but I suspected she would report the request immediately rather than risk her own standing. In the end, I kept returning to the same simple, dangerous idea, the only piece of authority still technically within my reach, my ordinary role as a trade officer, and the routine consultations that role still permitted me to schedule without triggering the same layers of review that any formal diplomatic request would face. There was, admittedly, a version of this plan where everything went smoothly, where Marin Doyle spoke calmly and clearly, where the council listened with open minds, and where the fleet quietly stood down without further incident. There was also a version where the council saw straight through my attempt, dismissed the entire session as a waste of their limited time, and proceeded with the demonstration exactly as planned, only now with the added irritation of a junior trade officer who had tried to manipulate their schedule. I could not know, sitting there in the dark with the stars turning slowly outside my window, which version I was about to walk into. I only knew that doing nothing at all had already stopped feeling like an option I could live with. I did not know yet how I was going to arrange something like that, working within a command structure that had already dismissed my explanations twice. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep into every one of my hearts, that I had to try, because the alternative, standing by quietly while two civilizations stumbled toward conflict over a misunderstanding this small, was something I was no longer willing to accept. There was only one way I could think of to get Marin Doyle in front of Compact Command before the demonstration fleet arrived in Earth's visible sky, and it meant risking my entire career in the process. I could not request formal clearance for a live communication between a private human citizen and the Compact War Council. That request would take days to process, days we did not have, and it would almost certainly be denied outright by someone far more cautious than I was. So instead, I used my remaining trade authority, the one piece of clearance nobody had thought to revoke yet, to schedule what I labeled, on official record, as a routine follow-up trade consultation regarding disputed transaction terms. It was technically true. It was also, in every practical sense, a complete misrepresentation of what I actually intended to do. I contacted Marin Doyle again, this time explaining exactly what I needed from her, and exactly how much was riding on it. "You want me to talk to the actual military people in charge of the fleet," she said slowly, and I could hear the disbelief in her voice even through the distorted connection. "The ones who might actually decide to do something about all this." "Yes," I said. "I believe if they hear your intentions directly from you, in your own words, it may change how they interpret this entire situation." "And if it doesn't," she asked, "if I say the wrong thing and make everything worse instead?" It was a fair question, and I did not have a comfortable answer for her. "I do not believe you will make it worse," I said honestly. "I believe you may be the only person capable of making it better, because you are the only one who can explain what you actually meant, without any translation, without any assumptions standing in the way." There was a long pause on the line. "Okay," she finally said. "Tell me when." The consultation was scheduled for the following morning, timed deliberately to occur before the demonstration fleet crossed into visible range of Earth's detection networks. I informed Keswick Rowe only after the session was already locked into the command schedule, framing it as an opportunity to gather final clarifying testimony before the demonstration proceeded. I fully expected him to cancel it the moment he realized what I actually intended. To my quiet relief, though perhaps also to his own curiosity about how a single human might respond under that kind of pressure, he allowed it to continue, though he made it clear, in the flattest tone he had used with me yet, that if this consultation produced nothing useful, the demonstration would proceed exactly as planned, with no further delay. The council chamber where the session took place was larger and colder than any room I had stood in during this entire crisis. A long curved table stretched across one side, occupied by Keswick Rowe, Sela Yun, and 4 additional officers I had never personally met, including a War Council admiral named Torv Kesan, whose reputation for battlefield decisiveness was known even to junior trade officers like myself. At the center of the room, a large display hovered, ready to project the live communication feed the moment the session began. I stood near the display, my heart's pounding in a rhythm I could not calm, and initiated the connection. Marin Doyle's face appeared on the screen a moment later, slightly grainy from the relay distortion, sitting at what looked like her kitchen table, a mug of something steaming beside her hand. She looked nervous, but not overwhelmed, the same steady composure I had noticed the very first time we met at the trade counter. "Hi," she said, glancing around at the row of unfamiliar faces staring back at her through the screen. "Wow, okay, that's a lot of people. Hello, everyone." Nobody responded immediately. Admiral Torv Kesan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "You are the individual who offered currency for a war-class cruiser," he said, his voice carrying none of the flat calm Keswick favored, but something sharper, more direct, the voice of a man used to commanding fleets, rather than diplomatic exchanges. "Yeah, that was me," Marin said, offering a small, slightly awkward smile. "Sorry about all this, by the way. I really didn't mean to cause a whole thing." "Explain to this council," Torv said, "why you believed it appropriate to negotiate the price of a military vessel, as though it were a common commodity." Marin tilted her head slightly, considering the question with the same thoughtful expression she might have given a genuinely difficult crossword puzzle. "Honestly, because that's just how buying things works, where I'm from. You see a price, and if it feels high, you ask if there's any flexibility. Sometimes people say no. Sometimes they say yes. It's not really about the item itself. It's just about seeing what's possible. And if we had said yes," Torv pressed, "if we had accepted your offer of spare change for a vessel capable of leveling a city, what then?" Marin actually laughed, a short, surprised sound that echoed slightly through the chamber speakers. "Honestly, I probably would have been really confused, and then I would have asked what I was supposed to do with a giant warship, because I definitely don't have anywhere to park it. A few of the officers exchanged glances at that. I could not tell whether they found it reassuring or even more unsettling than before. "You do not fear the power such a vessel represents," Sela Yun said, leaning forward slightly. "Does that not concern you? A weapon of that magnitude, and your first instinct was to attempt to lower its price, rather than to consider its consequence." Marin's expression shifted, softening into something more thoughtful, less playful than before. "I mean, I get why that sounds strange to you," she said. "But it's not that I don't understand what a warship is capable of. It's more that, where I'm from, we've kind of gotten used to living next to enormous, terrifying things without letting them run our whole lives. We've got weapons on our own planet that could end entire cities. We built those ourselves, a long time before we ever met any of you. And somehow, we still have to go grocery shopping and pay rent and haggle over car prices because life keeps going whether you're scared or not. I guess we just decided a long time ago that letting fear run the whole show wasn't really a way to live. Doesn't mean I don't respect what your ships can do. I definitely do. I just don't think respecting something means I have to be too scared to ask a question about it." One of the officers I had not been introduced to, a quiet Chrysalin woman seated near the far end of the table, leaned forward slightly and asked a question of her own, her voice softer than the others. "Do you not worry," she said, "that this comfort you describe, this ease with destruction, might one day make your species careless with it? That familiarity might dull the caution such power deserves?" Marin considered the question for a long moment, turning her mug slowly between her hands. "I think about that more than you'd probably guess," she finally said. "I don't think we've gotten it right, not even close. We've made some real messes because of that exact carelessness. But I think the answer isn't to be constantly terrified either. I think it's somewhere in between, where you respect a thing enough to be careful with it, without letting the fear of it control every decision you make. We're still figuring out where that line is. Honestly, I think every species probably is." The chamber went quiet after that, quieter than it had been at any point during the session. I watched Admiral Torv Kassan's expression carefully, searching for some sign of how he was receiving her words, but his face remained unreadable, the same practiced neutrality every senior officer seemed to master over years of command. It was Keswick Rowe who finally broke the silence, his flat voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "You are telling this council," he said, "that your species has learned to live beside its own capacity for destruction, without allowing that capacity to dictate your daily behavior." "Pretty much, yeah," Marin said. "I mean badly, sometimes. We've made plenty of mistakes doing it. But yeah, that's kind of the general idea." Torv Kassan leaned back slightly in his chair, and for the first time since the session began, something shifted in his posture, a small release of tension that I almost missed entirely. "In my experience," he said slowly, "civilizations that fear power tend to eventually reach for it themselves, out of desperation, in an attempt to close the gap between themselves and those who intimidate them. It is often the fearful ones who become dangerous, not the confident ones. A species that has already made peace with its own destructive capability, enough to go about ordinary life beside it, is, in a strange way, more predictable than one still consumed by fear of what it does not yet possess." One of the other officers, a quiet man near the end of the table whose name I never learned, asked Marin directly whether she would be willing, in the future, to consult with a translator before entering any further negotiations involving compact military property. Marin nodded immediately. "Yeah, absolutely," she said. "Honestly, I think that's a great idea for both of us. Saves everyone a lot of stress." A small ripple of something that might almost have been quiet amusement passed through a few of the officers at that, the first hint of anything resembling levity since the session had begun. "Predictable does not mean harmless," Sela Yun said quietly. "No," Torv agreed, "but it does mean something we can work with, rather than something we must immediately guard against." The debate that followed lasted nearly another hour, officers speaking over one another, referencing historical precedent, arguing military doctrine, weighing risk against reassurance. Marin remained on the screen the entire time, occasionally answering direct questions when they were asked of her, but mostly sitting quietly, sipping from her mug, watching an alien war council debate the fate of her entire planet with the same patient, unhurried expression she had worn back at the trade counter, waiting to see if I would take her offer seriously. In the end, it was not a single dramatic moment that resolved the crisis, but a slow, grinding shift in consensus, built one argument at a time, until Admiral Torv Kassan finally raised a hand, silencing the room, and delivered the decision that I had spent the last several days desperately hoping for. "The demonstration fleet will hold its current position," he said. "It will not advance further toward Sol. Formal contact will instead be established with Earth's Defense Council, through proper diplomatic channels, to clarify the nature of this misunderstanding and establish clearer protocols for future trade negotiations between our peoples." Sela Yun raised one final point before the decision was formally recorded, her voice carrying less resistance now than it had at any earlier point in the crisis. "I would still recommend continued observation," she said, "not out of distrust, but out of prudence. A single conversation, however honest, does not replace the value of sustained understanding." Torv Kassan nodded slowly at that, and I found myself agreeing with her as well, understanding that trust between civilizations was rarely built in a single afternoon, no matter how compelling that afternoon's conversation had been. What mattered, I thought, was that the door toward understanding had been opened at all, rather than sealed shut behind the closing ranks of an approaching fleet. A wave of relief passed through me so intense that I nearly lost my footing where I stood. "Furthermore," Torv continued, glancing toward the screen where Marin Doyle still sat, watching with wide, hopeful eyes, "I would like it noted in the official record that this council's understanding of humanity has been meaningfully expanded today, not through demonstration of our strength, but through a single individual's willingness to speak plainly, under pressure, without performance or deception. That is not a small thing, in my experience. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of behavior we should hope to encounter more often, rather than less." Marin blinked at the screen, clearly startled by the sudden shift in tone. "Wait, so does that mean everything's okay now? Like, actually okay?" "For now," Torv said, something that might have almost been the beginning of a smile touching the corner of his expression, "though I would strongly suggest, Ms. Doyle, that in the future you consider asking a translator officer whether a phrase carries unintended weight before offering spare change for a warship." Marin laughed, relief plain in her voice. "Yeah, noted. Loud and clear. No more haggling over spaceships. I promise." The session ended shortly after, the connection fading from the display, leaving the chamber quiet once more, though the tension that had filled it only hours earlier had finally, unmistakably broken. I remained on the platform for several more months after that day, watching as formal diplomatic protocols were slowly rewritten to account for humanity's particular habits, their casual confidence, their strange, stubborn refusal to let fear dictate the way they approached even the largest, most dangerous things in their lives. Trade officers were given new training modules specifically addressing human negotiation behavior, so that no future officer would ever again mistake a simple attempt to haggle for a declaration of contempt. Corin Vass found me in the corridor a few days after the session, his relief plain on his face as he told me his cousin's battle group had been given new, far friendlier orders, redirected toward routine patrol rather than any further advance toward Sol. He thanked me, awkwardly, in the way people thank each other after a danger has passed, but before either of them fully understands how close it truly came, and I found myself thanking him in return, for reasons I did not fully explain, mostly because I did not think I could put into words how much it had meant to have one person on that platform who had looked at me with concern rather than suspicion during those long, uncertain days. Grace Whitfield and I exchanged several more messages in the weeks that followed. our tone gradually shifting from cautious formality into something closer to genuine cooperation. She told me once, near the end of one exchange, that Earth's Defense Council had spent an entire afternoon debating how to explain the incident in their own official records, and that the closest anyone had come to a satisfying summary was simply writing that a misunderstanding over a purchase had been resolved through direct conversation. I told her that our own records, as far as I knew, would likely say something very similar, though I suspected our historians would spend considerably longer arguing over the wording. I still think, sometimes, about that first afternoon, about the sound of those small metal coins hitting the glass counter, about how close two entire civilizations came to conflict over something so small, so easily misunderstood, and so entirely harmless in its original intention. I have come to understand something about humanity that I do not think any historical archive or military briefing could have taught me nearly as effectively as that single conversation did. Their greatest strength was never the size of their fleets, or the power of their weapons, or even the resilience so often mentioned in compact reports about their species. It was something quieter than that, something far harder to measure, and far more difficult to shake. It was the simple, unshaken habit of asking, calmly and without fear, whether there might be a better deal available, no matter how large the stakes, no matter who happened to be standing on the other side of the counter. And somewhere down on that quiet, blue, endlessly ordinary planet, Marin Doyle was almost certainly still doing exactly that, completely unaware that she had once come within a single misunderstanding of changing the course of two civilizations, simply by asking a question she had asked 100 times before, about spare change and whether anyone happened to take card instead.